Thank you very much. Honored parliamentarians, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to be here today to present to you the preliminary findings of the EU-Japan comparative report on the economic empowerment of women. You will find a PowerPoint slide summary and also the executive summary in text in your packet, which you can follow along with this. Now, I only have 20 minutes to try to summarize this for you, so I will try to touch on the key points here, and hopefully that will form the basis of a discussion afterwards among us all in the panels and beyond. So, as many of the distinguished speakers before me have emphasized, gender equality is of course both key to social equality but also economic growth. And this must come from public policy, but also from corporations. Companies play a key role in the economic empowerment of women. Consequently, the goal of this report is really threefold. First, to compare across Japan and the EU the current situation of women's economic empowerment. Secondly, to look at some key case studies of companies to identify best practices in women's economic empowerment. And thirdly, based on this, to propose some corporate and governmental policy initiatives that can further women's empowerment. Now, if we start with the macro overview, the first question here, of course, is labor force participation. There are many ways to measure labor force participation. For comparative reasons, I've chosen the OECD approach. And so as we can see here on the top graph, Japan's labor force participation is a little bit under 50% by this measure, and the EU's is a little bit above 50%. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that these two are not that different. In both cases, women do lag behind men. However, if we look at part-time employment, we see a much more significant difference. In Japan, 37.2% of women are employed in part-time, whereas this is only around 20% in the EU. There are, of course, exceptions in the EU, but generally Japan has more part-time employed women than EU. Furthermore, what is, I think, really interesting is that if we look at this bottom graph, we see that even though Japan has a large portion of women employed in part-time, the percentage that are involuntarily employed part-time, in other words, who would like to work full-time, is about the same ratio as the EU, 7.6% versus 6.6%. In other words, there's a large portion of women in Japan who have chosen to work in part-time and would like to stay in part-time, relatively speaking, much larger than there are in the EU. Now, Japan is not alone in this. There are other countries that are similar. I draw your attention to the bottom graph, the case of Netherlands. The Netherlands has a large portion of women who work part-time, and most of these seem to be doing so voluntarily. In other words, the number of involuntary workers are very low in the Netherlands. So we can compare Netherlands and Japan for a short comparative case to understand this phenomenon a little bit better. In the case of the Netherlands, first of all, if we talk about cultural factors, in the Netherlands, as in Japan, there is still a strong traditional role for the mother to play in the household. And so this, of course, is one reason for why women would choose to work in part-time rather than full-time in both countries. And in this sense, they differ from perhaps some of the Nordic countries where the mother's role is not as strong anymore. What is interesting in the case of the Netherlands is that a part-time job is seen as equal to a full-time job, both on the institutional level, legally, but also in corporations. So in other words, a woman can work part-time, or a man can work part-time, and then re-enter, work full-time, and still achieve a high managerial position. And this shows because 13.1% of board members in the Netherlands are women. And in fact, if you look at full-time working women, they're more likely to be managers than full-time working men in the Netherlands. So how does this compare with the leadership roles of women in the Japanese context? Well, in Japan, as we can see, women are grossly underrepresented in leadership roles. We had the minister here, Minister Kato, presenting numbers that show that these numbers are clearly improving. However, they are still quite low. So according to the OECD, 37% of professional workers, so that includes managers, engineers, professional service workers, are women. This compares to about 48% in the EU. Furthermore, if we look higher up, senior management in Japan is 7% versus the EU average of 24%. And at board members, it's 1.5% for Japan versus 21.2% in the EU average. So we do have a gendered roles in terms of senior management in Japan. And it is hard for Japanese women to reach these most senior roles, even when they are part of the labor market. So why is this? What are these barriers to women's leadership in Japan? Well, clearly there are both internal, organizational, and also external societal factors. If we look at internal organizational factors, the most obvious one, perhaps common, also similar to the EU, are assumptions about women's leadership. We heard the distinguished speakers before mentioning the difficulties they had faced in being female leaders in their own countries. Many women in Japan can feel the same thing. It's not assumed that a woman can be leader. And indeed, the top left-hand graph here is from the World Economic Forum, and it shows that the ability of women to actually be leaders is ranked lowest in this survey in Japan. Pretty much, there's a few countries that are close, but it's lower, far lower than the EU average. Another reason is, of course, lack of role models. Japanese women in universities, when they graduate, enter companies, they must see in front of them a role model. They must see that this is achievable. And because of the few number of women who are in senior management positions, it is hard for young women to see that this is something that they could aspire to. And so this means that many of them do not consider even the idea of being managers because they don't see that in front of themselves. There are also structural factors internally. Overtime work is very demanding in Japan. There is a system of single postings whereby men traditionally would leave their families and work away from the family, oftentimes for years at a time. And this is, of course, very difficult in Japan if the mother has a strong role in the household. Finally, what I found is that even in companies that are very progressive and try to help women, there is what I call this pedestal treatment. And what this means is that the companies are so understanding when women have children that they give them positive discrimination. They allow them to go home early. They give them lighter workloads, easier tasks. The negative effect of this, of course, is that when it comes to promotion, when it comes to becoming evaluated as a manager, then these women do not have the same experience or the same amount of time in the company. And so they have a harder time becoming senior leaders and senior managers. And I'd like to add that this is true, has been true in the EU as well. So this is not necessarily, and in the United States. So this is not a Japan-specific phenomenon only. Now, in addition to these internal factors, there are also external factors. Lack of daycare facilities make it hard for women to balance their roles. There are tax and pension disincentives that sometimes keep women from taking full jobs. And, of course, there are these strong gender roles in the society overall, which also prevent women from taking these positions. In terms of this last point, one graph that has often been shown is this one on the bottom, which shows the number of minutes that men spend at home with families working. And the emphasis here has been that Japanese men spend far less time at home working with the family than their European counterparts. And in fact, Japanese women put in 5 times as much time in the home as their male counterparts. Now, I think this graph is very important and important to dig into more because it really explains, I think, a lot of what the challenges are. Because if we look at this, we would expect, well, this must mean that Japanese women work much more in the home than their European counterparts. Well, if we look at the top graph on the next page, we see that indeed, Japanese women do spend more time in unpaid work. However, it's not a significantly higher amount of time. And in fact, there are other European countries where the time spent in unpaid work is just as high as the amount of time that Japanese women spent. Moreover, if we look at the bottom graph, we also see that the number of hours, minutes that Japanese women actually spend in work is about the same as as European women. In other words, Japanese women do not spend less time at work than the European counterparts. Rather, the big contrast here, of course, is the amount of time that men spend in work in Japan. This is the outlier data point on this graph. And I think this explains very much some of the structural barriers within companies. First, because then men cannot help out at home. So then, of course, Japanese women face more pressures to take care of children. But secondly, because men then set the standard for how much time needs to be spent at work to become a manager. You need to spend a certain amount of time overtime, you need to put in face time, you need to spend long hours in the office. And so for Japanese women, the hurdle of getting into those managerial positions is arguably higher than it is for European women just because of the nature of jobs itself, the amount of time that you have to spend working in Japan. And I think this is one reason for why a lot of Japanese women actually voluntarily choose to do part-time work, because they do not want to work these long hours. Most people probably do not want to work these long hours. So, what are the implications of this for further barriers? Well, of course, if we look at the amount of work, amount of paid for work, Japanese women, like their EU counterparts, face unequal work. They only earn about 60% as much as their male counterparts. But when it comes to actual take-home pay, which is the bottom graph here, then what we see is that Japanese women lag their male counterparts even further, because they're working fewer hours than their male counterparts. Now, in addition to the pay gap that this creates, it also, of course, creates what we call a pension gap. The pension gap has been paid less attention to, but essentially the pension gap is based on the number of years and hours that you've worked, the positions that you've worked, and your life expectancy. And in the case of Japan, all of these, of course, disadvantage women. Now, Japan's pension gap is actually not as bad as the EU, as many countries in the EU, but what we do find is that in old age, there is a high poverty rate for women, because many of them perhaps have worked part-time because they don't have access to the same pensions. And so in this way, these structural factors that keep women in part-time jobs really creates a lot of issues for economic empowerment and disempowers women economically. So, in summary, the Japanese female labor force participation ratio is in fact similar to the EU average. But more Japanese women work in part-time positions. And they actively choose to do so because the hurdle to getting into a managerial job is so much higher, structurally, in terms of work time, than it is in the EU. Now, this results then in a significant wage gap and, of course, is detrimental to them. And so, over the long term, this kind of part-time work is not viable. It's not viable for the economy, but it's also not viable for companies, because companies, of course, miss out on talented individuals and people who can actually promote their business. And so, in the next section, what I would like to turn to is the case companies that I have looked at. I've looked specifically at 4 case companies, and I want to emphasize that the idea here was to identify best practices. So I have not looked at typical companies. I have purposely selected ones that are doing quite well with gender equality and women's empowerment. So as you can see, there are 2 from the EU and 2 from Japan. The ones from Japan are Calbee, which makes foodstuffs and consumer products, and IHI, which makes heavy industrial equipment and engines, among other things. In the EU, I've looked at Unilever and Shell, And so Unilever, again, is a consumer products company, and Shell also is a heavy industry company. So we can see that they are similar and can be compared across industries. All of these have received awards for their gender diversity policies. Calbee and IHI are on the so-called Nadeshiko list that's created here in Japan for companies that have promoted diversity. I'm also happy to note that we actually have the CEO of Calbee coming later this afternoon. I want to stress I did not know that he was coming. That's not why I chose the company. But these are great companies that have done an excellent job. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to only focus on actually Calbee and IHI. You have the rest of the information in the PowerPoint package. But let me just talk a little bit about what I have found their practices to be and why I think they've been quite successful. So if we start with Calbee, excuse me. So one of the key things about Calbee really is its CEO. Mr. Akira Matsumoto has been very visible in terms of promoting diversity, not only internally but also externally. Now, why is this important? Well, because leadership signals to the company, to the people within the company, that this is serious. The diversity is not just a symbolic thing that we're doing, but this is actually what's expected of you, and expected of you in your performance. And so by taking on this leadership role very forcefully, it trickles down to other managers who are actually working in the company on a daily basis. And in that sense, it also reinforces diversity strategies. And as a side note, I can say that we see the same thing with Unilever, with Shell, and also with IHI. Second, in Calbee's emphasis on this, the focus has always been on the business case for women. Specifically, their argument has been that, well, we have women consumers, and so if we employ more women, they will understand our consumers. They will understand their wants and needs. It will lead to better product development. Now, this is important, of course, both to kind of motivate for themselves, but also to show other people within the organization, to get buy-in from men and from senior management, rather than just promoting it on the basis of gender equality, because then it's harder to argue for it. It's much easier to say this impacts the bottom line than to show that. Now, as I said, by taking on this role as the leader, the company says that diversity is important, but they do not make diversity a specific and explicit form of evaluation. Why? Because then it becomes compliance. It becomes just a number that you check off on a box, you promoted so and so many women. Rather, it's something that passes through all of what they do, just like cost-benefit analysis or anything like that. So it's central to the entire discussion of the company rather than being a box to tick. And what they specifically do then, of course, is to try to emphasize overwork, to change that. Overwork is frowned upon. Productivity is emphasized. This is something positive. And so if you are done with your work at Calbee, you're welcome to go home at any time, regardless of when it is. And the CEO embodies this. They also emphasize work style change, flex time, and so on. And so Calbee, what Calbee is trying to do is lower that barrier, or that barrier for women, to make it easier for them to work in the companies. If we then contrast this to IHI, and I want to emphasize there's not one or better here. There are many similarities among these, but they also have different approaches. One of IHI's big strengths is that they have female role models. They have a member of the executive team, Nobuko Mizumoto, who is also very visible, but they also have many women in managerial positions, and they make sure to emphasize them in internal publications and make sure that the company knows them. Not only do they lift these role models up, but they've also created networks. They've tasked women who are managers to be in charge of networks and to network with other women in order to support them and to promote them. And what they do in particular is try to convince them to say, you can do this, you can be a manager as well. Along the same path, this final point here, They support managerial progression through career development, career management. They actively work with people and say, this is what your career would look like, both men and women. And in that sense, they get an idea that they can be managers. They also engage in extensive gender diversity training. Now, gender diversity training has sometimes gotten a bad rap, but I think what this company does well is that they do this continuously. Not once, every year in January or some token thing, but on regular intervals and 3-day sessions and so on. And this really creates for the company the understanding that this is serious. Let me move to some final recommendations then. For corporations, what does this mean? I think first, as we talked about, the CEO must lead by example. This must come from the top. The business case for gender is how it must be emphasized. This is how buy-in will be gotten. In the case of Japan, the work styles need to change. As I showed on the graph before, one of the biggest issues in Japan is, of course, the number of hours being worked. This needs to be reduced. Both of these companies have worked very hard on this. Performance-based evaluations, for example. Things that make it possible for people to have both a private life and a corporate life. Female role models need to be showcased. Not just identified, but showcased, cultivated, exemplified. And we need to foster, through this, career identities for both women and men. And finally, need to engage senior sponsors. In other words, senior men who will bring up women and help them become managers. In terms of public policy recommendations, they're along similar lines. Reduce household work in various ways by deregulating markets, offer subsidies, increase incentives for paternity leave. I was very happy to hear the minister talking about a lot of these, so it seems like this is already on the way. Incentivize full-time work as well through tax reform. And really strictly enforce those regulations for overwork. In doing this, I think the hurdle can come down and we can get more women into work that empowers them. Thank you very much.